let me go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight, presenter. He's known to a lot of historians in and out of the Army, Charles Bowery Jr. He is the executive director of the U.S. Army Center of Military History at Fort McNair, downtown D.C., where I had the privilege to work, including a part of his when he came and became the executive director. He had a distinguished military career in the U.S. Army in the aviation branch, including as a battalion commander. Retired from the Army as a uniform guy, and now he is a civilian guy for the Army at our Center of Military History. Perhaps more relevant to tonight's presentation, he's a co-author of the Guide to the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign, which is part of the U.S. Army War College Guides to Civil War Battles. That came out back in 2014, but that's why we asked him to be with us, because of his expertise. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and again welcome you to the program. We've got a big crowd tonight, but without further ado, welcome to our audience and welcome to Charles Bowery, our speaker. Good evening, Charles.
Good evening, John, and thank you for having me. Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you all for joining me for this battle brief tonight. Tonight, I'd like to talk about why I believe the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign is the most interesting and indeed decisive campaign that occurred during the course of the American Civil War. This iconic statement of General Robert E. Lee, spoken to a subordinate during the spring of 1864, captures the reasons for the lack of scholarly and popular attention to the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign, which by any metric was the biggest, most diverse, and most decisive campaign of the American Civil War. From June 1864 to April of 1865, approximately 250,000 American and Confederate soldiers, sailors, and civilians were swept up in a series of battles for possession of the political and logistical center of gravity of the Confederate States of America in operations that extended north to Washington, D.C., west to the Shenandoah Valley, and south to the border with North Carolina. The campaign featured joint Army-Navy operations and combined arms maneuver by large cavalry and infantry forces, raids, and massive logistical, communications, and medical operations, as well as siege works on a grand scale, really never before seen on the North American continent. The campaign also saw the war's largest battlefield employment of Black soldiers, influenced the outcome of the 1864 presidential election, and led directly to the surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Court House. In many respects, the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign represented 19th century war at its most total, and I put air quotes around that word total, in terms of its tools, its participants, and its impacts, and prefigured many aspects of 20th century warfare in its conduct. But even so, the campaign has come down through history as a siege whose outcome was predetermined when it started, even though at about the same time as Lee made this statement to a subordinate, President Abraham Lincoln was making plans for his defeat in the coming election because he was that concerned about the course of the war for the Union and the war for America. The Richmond-Petersburg Campaign shaped and was shaped by many of the military, political, and social dynamics that produced and fueled the course of the American Civil War. I'm making an argument here for the campaign's contingency, the idea that nothing in its outcome was foreordained. Next slide, please. One could argue that the true turning point in the course of the Civil War was the appointment in early 1864 of Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, on the top right of the slide, to command of the armies of the United States. Grant brought to the cause of the Union an iron will, moral courage, emotional intelligence, strategic vision, operational acumen, and perhaps most importantly for the war's outcome, strategic followership and the ability to work and communicate with his commander-in-chief, President Lincoln. Grant developed an approach for 1864 involving simultaneous offensives in the Eastern, Western, and Trans-Mississippi theaters aimed at 3 Confederate political, population, and logistics centers. Going from east to west, the Richmond-Petersburg area, Atlanta, Georgia, and Mobile, Alabama, represented on your maps. Grant himself chose to co-locate his headquarters in the field with Major General George Meade's Army of the Potomac, both for political and military reasons. And that would allow that army to cooperate with Major General Benjamin Butler's Army of the James to converge on Richmond and Petersburg, trapping Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, which by 1864 had really represented the moral and physical heart of the Confederate cause. William T. Sherman operated in complete understanding of Grant's intent in Georgia and really needed no oversight, while Franz Sigel and Nathaniel T. Banks owed their positions to political sensibilities, and that's why they were in command. Sigel's advance up the Shenandoah Valley came to a halt in the summer of 1864 at New Market, Virginia, while Banks never even mounted an attack or an offensive against Mobile, Alabama, because his force remained committed to another operation in the Red River Valley of northern Louisiana. Benjamin Butler, a Republican politician with pronounced abolitionist leanings, led his force up the James River and eventually occupied Bermuda Hundred, a small peninsula at the confluence of the James and Appomattox rivers between Richmond and Petersburg, from where he threatened both cities by June of 1864. And I've got a couple of quotes there on the slide that kind of get to Grant's and Lincoln's thoughts about this federal campaign. While a number of historians have argued that Sherman's offensive against Atlanta was in fact the most important component of the 1864 plan, George Meade's Overland campaign was always going to be the most visible and noteworthy, owing to its closeness to the warring capitals and the famous personalities involved. On 4 May 1864, Meade's Army of the Potomac, accompanied by the independent 9th Army Corps, commanded by Ambrose Burnside, crossed the Rapidan River and opened the Overland campaign. What followed was a month of virtually continuous fighting in a series of battles that became known for their ferocity in American military history. In a series of battles around the town of Chancellorsville, the site of a Confederate victory a year earlier, at Spotsylvania Court House, along the North Anna River, and at Cold Harbor on the gates of Richmond, American forces battered Lee's Confederates and forced them to withdraw south to successive positions, as you see on the map, with Grant constantly moving around the eastern flank of the Confederate forces, both to maneuver and to protect his lines of communication and supply with Washington, D.C., and with the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers. This occurred and forced Grant, or Lee, to withdraw south, rather, but at tremendous expense, grievous expense indeed. The 30 days of fighting cost Ulysses S. Grant and the Union Army some 55,000 casualties, and Lee himself around 35,000 irreplaceable Confederate soldiers. By the first week in June, Grant's Eastern Army Group, composed of Meade's and Butler's armies, threatened Richmond and Petersburg from the northeast and the east, controlled river and railroad lines of communication to the Chesapeake Bay. But in spite of this success, critics pointed out that Grant was merely in the same position as had been his predecessor's Army of the Potomac under General George McClellan a mere 2 years before, during the Peninsula Campaign. So Grant, at this point, and this is June of 1864, faces a genuine strategic and operational decision point in the campaign for Virginia. And we have an image on the right-hand side of the slide, which shows a group of African Americans harvesting the dead from the Cold Harbor battlefield. So they've got a stretcher with skulls and bones of soldiers killed in the battles around Cold Harbor in June of 1864. Next slide, please. Ulysses S. Grant decided to maintain his operational approach in Virginia. And this was an approach that he had honed and demonstrated on multiple occasions in the Western theater of the Civil War. Beginning on 7 June 1864, Grant evacuated his positions at Cold Harbor to cross the James River. He sent the 18th Corps of the Army of the James, commanded by Major General William F. Smith, who's pictured on the lower right of the slide, Brigadier General William F. Smith, I'm sorry, via the James, to the James River, via the Pamunkey and James Rivers, back to City Point and Bermuda Hundred to rejoin the Army of the James and to be in position to threaten Petersburg as a part of his larger plan. He then had Meade march the Army of the Potomac, which now formally included Burnside's 9th Corps, via 3 converging routes over the land north of the James River, reaching the north bank of the James by 13 June of 1864. Meade conducted a truly brilliant screening and deception effort with his 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, which shielded and kept Lee in place along the Chickahominy River for a critical 48 hours during the movement, which had the effect of concealing the true objective of Grant's movement from Lee and made him remain in place to protect Richmond until he could gain true clarity on what Grant was actually doing. And this was a combined deception effort of the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac and elements of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac, but brilliantly conducted by George Meade. On 14 June, the Army of the Potomac's wagons and artillery crossed over the James River on what was at the time the longest pontoon bridge ever constructed. That is pictured above in a contemporary sketch, and you can see soldiers moving across the bridge over the James. And then on the top right is a photograph of the pontoon bridge from the north bank of the James looking south. The US Navy ferried the Army's infantry across the James River at Wilson's Wharf, which was a few miles closer to Petersburg, so that by the early morning of 15 June 1864, the two armies were only a few miles away from Petersburg, which was lightly defended at the time by a small force under General P.G.T. Beauregard and some local militia in the Petersburg area. 15 June 1864 marked the beginning of the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign. And on that date, the first of a total of 8 battles of Petersburg began. And what I like to tell people is that this is not so much the siege of Petersburg as a multi-layered 8-month campaign for the Richmond and Petersburg area. And I hope to depict this on the map. I'll show these battles in sequence by highlighting them with some blue slides. And so if I could ask for the first build. On 15 to 18 June, American forces, including a brigade of African-American soldiers, captured a section of the Confederate Dimmock line adjacent to the Appomattox River in the area of the current battlefield visitor center, the National Park Service Battlefield Visitor Center. First Petersburg, however, represents one of the war's greatest missed opportunities for American forces because Grant's and Meade's forces were not able to break into and capture the city of Petersburg due to some elements of, frankly, of friction on the battlefield, a stout resistance by Confederate forces, some unfamiliarity with the terrain, and the general complexity of military operations, as well as extremely hot and dusty weather, which struck the forces of both sides in a profound way during the campaign. But by the night of 15 June, the federal forces are poised on the outskirts of Petersburg. And at this point, it's become clear that Petersburg is Grant's real objective. And so Lee begins to transfer his Army of Northern Virginia from the north bank of the James to the south to reinforce Petersburg. Next build, please. Meade spent the rest of June and July attempting to maneuver southward around the Confederate right flank in an effort to both eject Lee from Petersburg and capture the city, but also to sever some critical supply lines leading into Petersburg from the south, mainly the Jerusalem Plank Road and the Weldon Railroad. Build, please. These attacks were generally unsuccessful, however, and Lee was able to maintain his positions and indeed harden his positions around Petersburg. At the end of July, American forces attempted to explode a mine beneath the Confederate lines just east of Petersburg, combined with an attack north of the James River. Build, please. And Meade repeated this method in August with no success. Throughout these battles, Lee maintained his communications to the south and the west and hardened his defensive lines around Petersburg and Richmond as the November presidential election approached. During the summer months, both armies detached forces to operate against the Confederate logistical and communications facilities in the Shenandoah Valley and along the Virginia Central Railroad. And in early July, a Confederate force under General Jubal Early, who by this point was one of Lee's corps commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia, raided north into Maryland and reached eventually the Washington fortifications up at Fort Stevens before being turned back under the direct gaze of President Abraham Lincoln, who watched much of the action from Fort Stevens. The price of gold raised precipitously during the summer as the value of Union greenback currency declined, as people became very pessimistic about the course of the war during the summer. And Grant appeared really no closer to final victory during what, even for Southside Virginia, was a brutally hot summer for campaigning. Bill, please. In late September, Grant, Meade, and Butler attempted yet another simultaneous attack north and south of the James River and had some success in the area of Chaffin's Bluff, which is north of the James, capturing a portion of the Richmond intermediate line of defenses. Sherman captured Atlanta, Georgia in September, however, and Lincoln won election in November over the Democratic challenger, General George McClellan, due in large part to federal military successes on the battlefield in Georgia, and then the measured American successes around Petersburg as well. As 1865 dawned, George Meade and the Army of the Potomac controlled the land around Petersburg for the most part from the east and continued to inch south and west around Lee's right flank, gaining control of the Petersburg and Weldon Railroad, which was Lee's main line of supply down into the deep south and north and the Carolinas, and began to launch limited attacks against the Boydton Plank Road, which was really Lee's sole remaining road line of communications and supply to the rest of the Confederacy. His main line of supply at this point remained the South Side Railroad, which leads, of course, down to southwestern Virginia and into Tennessee. But that was really his only link to the outside at this point. Lee's prophecy, which we read on the first slide in the presentation, came true by late March. And if we could get the next build, please. And a huge and well-supplied American Army group moved decisively beginning on 31 March 1865, closing a vice around the defenders of Richmond and Petersburg. Robert E. Lee had sensed this movement, however, and on 25 March, he launched a desperate spoiling attack, the last offensive operation of the Army of Northern Virginia, against a fort on the eastern approaches to Petersburg at Fort Stedman. And you've got a post-battle view of the interior of Fort Stedman up on the top right of the slide. This spoiling attack failed in the face of overwhelming opposition from federal forces. And by this point, the fate of Petersburg and Richmond, and the fate of Lee's army, indeed, was well on the way to being sealed. Before dawn on 2 April 1865, U.S. Army guns opened all along the 30-mile front around Petersburg, and American troops surged forward, cracking the Confederate defenses in the 8th and final Battle of Petersburg. And those battles are indicated by the large square box on the slide. The site of the initial breakthrough in this 8th Battle of Petersburg is preserved south of Petersburg at the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier and Pamplin Park, which maintains some of the best preserved extant Civil War fortifications still in existence, as well as engaging exhibits and programs. By nightfall on 2 April 1865, one of Lee's corps commanders, A.P. Hill, was dead, and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia was fleeing westward for its life along the South Side Railroad and would fight a meeting engagement with federal forces into the next day at Sutherland Station on its way westward. Next slide, please. And so in a very brief amount of time, an insanely short amount of time, that covers the 8 battles of Petersburg. And now I'd like to proceed to talk about some really interesting and important aspects of the campaign as well, beginning with the role of African-American soldiers in the Richmond-Petersburg campaign. One of the most redeeming and inspiring aspects of the Civil War was the role that formerly enslaved Black men and women played in gaining their own freedom. From 1863 to 1865, more than 200,000 Black men and women free and formerly enslaved, served the cause of the Union and freedom during the Civil War. African-American men did so first in locally raised volunteer regiments from the northern states, such as the famous 54th Massachusetts from the movie Glory. And I will point out at this point that our Preserving the Nation gallery at the National Army Museum holds and displays a flag fragment from the 54th Massachusetts colors carried at Fort Wagner, South Carolina. And then, of course, in regiments raised in Confederate states where Union forces operated throughout the war, such as in coastal South Carolina and western Louisiana. Still more Black soldiers served in regiments of the U.S. colored troops, which were federally raised, regular Army-like formations. All of these units were led by white officers, however, because even in the North, racism and racial stereotypes of Black incapacity continued to exist and persist. 2 entire divisions of Black regiments fought in the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign, one in each of the armies of the Potomac and the Army of the James. During the Overland Campaign, George Meade used his Black division for construction and guard duty, but Benjamin Butler, who again was an abolitionist and had first developed at Fort Monroe, Virginia in 1861, the concept of considering escaped slaves as contraband of war and thus free, employed his Black troops in reconnaissance duty and small military operations in Tidewater, Virginia. As a result, these soldiers had some operational experience that stood them in good stead at Petersburg. Throughout the Richmond-Petersburg campaign, Black regiments played an important role in several junctures. At the first Battle of Petersburg on 15 June, Black soldiers of the Army of the James captured positions after overcoming some initial confusion, and they played a major role in the capture of batteries 5 through 8 of the Dimmock Line in the first Battle of Petersburg on 15 June. Based on this experience, Ambrose Burnside, the 9th Corps commander, made the decision to use his Black division to lead an attack which would occur on a salient in the Confederate lines where a mine would explode. And of course, we're talking about the very famous Battle of the Crater on July 30th, 1864, and more about that in a moment. With Grant's tacit approval, however, Meade replaced at the last moment these Black soldiers with white troops because the American High Command was frankly worried about the political and optical impact of having Black soldiers sustain grievous casualties in an operation of this magnitude. And so the Black soldiers were placed in reserve and supported the attack. The most glorious day for Black soldiers in the campaign came on 30 September 1864, when Black regiments earned 14 Medals of Honor as a part of the fighting north of the James River during the 5th Offensive at Chaffin's Bluff. Sergeant Major William Carney, pictured above on the right of the slide, was one of the Medal of Honor recipients during this action after he picked up the colors of the 4th United States Colored Troops and led his men in the assault on New Market Heights, which captured Confederate positions. Black soldiers proved their worth and equality in repeated engagements during the campaign, such that by early 1865, the 25th Army Corps, Army of the James, was composed entirely of Black units in two divisions. And their corps insignia badge is shown on the top center of the slide. Black soldiers were among the first American forces to enter the ruined city of Richmond on 3 April 1865, and also played a prominent role in the defeat of Lee's army at Appomattox Court House. As they did in America's 20th century wars and even to today, Black soldiers fought as the colors of the 24th United States Colored Troops, shown on the left of the slide, proclaimed, to let soldiers in war be citizens in peace. Next slide, please. The explosion of the U.S. Army's mine under the Confederate defenses on 30 July 1864, known as the Battle of the Crater, and the desperate battle that followed for possession of the crater, is one of the most famous incidents in American military history. And so I'd like to spend a few moments on it, although there's certainly much more to the story than we'll get to tonight. A great deal of myth and misinformation still surrounds the event today. In early July, after Meade's forces failed to take Petersburg, a Northern Regimental commander, Colonel Henry Pleasants of the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment from the Eastern Pennsylvania mining country, developed a scheme to tunnel beneath Confederate lines where they jutted into Federal lines in a salient and explode a mine filled with black powder under the Confederate line. His corps commander, General Burnside, approved the expedition, and Pleasants and his men got to work. George Meade and Ulysses S. Grant allowed the operation to continue, but they were highly skeptical of its possibilities, as was most of the Union high command at the time. They wanted to see if it would work, frankly. They were quite desperate at this time for any method of cracking the Confederate line and changing the calculus of the campaign. And they also had the thought that this would keep men busy during a time when the operations around Petersburg were generally settling into a siege mode. But it's an indication above all of how desperate the US Army was for success here at Petersburg. Burnside planned for a brigade of black regiments in the division of Edward Ferrero to lead the assault. And Ferrero and his staff are pictured at the lower left or lower right of the slide. But as I said earlier, Meade overruled him and replaced the unit with white soldiers from the division of James Ledlie, who's depicted on the top right, one of the war's most incompetent commanders and a documented alcoholic. Enduring controversy surrounds the degree to which the black troops received or did not receive specialized training for the assault. The campaign's best chronicler, A. Wilson Green, judges that some of the regiments did indeed receive some basic drill training before the explosion, and they rehearsed some of the movements involved in the plan. But in general, the black regiments of the Army were consumed by construction and guard duties, as one can see in the photo of Ferrero and his staff. They are guarded on the right of the picture next to the staff under the tent eaves by a black soldier. In any case, on the morning of 30 July 1864, Pleasance's mine exploded skyward, as sketched at the moment by the Union sketch artist Alfred Woad, and Elliott's salient and its Confederate defenders simply ceased to exist. They were replaced by a bomb crater several hundred feet wide and some 30 feet deep, filled with the wreckage of the battle and with pieces of human bodies from the explosion in the salient. Ledlie sent his division forward while he remained in a dugout to the rear. And in any case, his men were frankly confused as to the intended scheme of maneuver because the decision had been made to change the composition of the assault a mere hours before the assault. They simply occupied the ground around the crater instead of attacking up and down the line and capturing the high ground in rear of the salient that in fact overlooked the town of Petersburg and was the key terrain in the sector. The other two divisions of the Ninth Corps, including Ferrero's black troops, attacked in support, but the entire force became fixed in place by the broken ground around the crater and the mass of bodies and destroyed materiel. And as you see the quotation on the slide, this day was the jubilee of fiends in human shape and without souls. This was a unique moment in military history. The Federal American troops around the crater were attacked by a Confederate force under General William Mahone, who was a local area native. They counterattacked by mid-afternoon, had retaken the crater itself, had forced back the American forces to their lines, and had captured hundreds of black and white American soldiers. And at this point, one of the most notable aspects of the battle and the war occurs when Confederate soldiers proceed to execute hundreds of black soldiers in and around the crater, many of whom were in the act of surrendering and were disarmed already. The orgy of violence that occurred at the crater and murder astounded everyone who witnessed it, black and white, American and Confederate. A number of black soldiers survived to be returned to bondage in the South, in fact, as evidenced by the advertisement depicted on the lower center of the slide, which is from a Charlottesville area newspaper in Virginia. And it lists the by name identities of captured black soldiers from the crater so that their enslavers can reclaim them and take them back into bondage. The Battle of the Crater truly embodied the desperation and ferocity of the war in its fourth year, as well as the war's true causes and motivation on the part of the South in the maintenance of white supremacy. US forces suffered almost 3,800 casualties on the day, approximately 18% of those engaged, mostly in the Ninth Corps and mostly among the Black units involved. Black troops at the crater sustained 1 man killed for every 1.8 men wounded, about 1,300 in total. The war's average ratio of killed to wounded was 1 to 4.8. And so this is an indicator of the true ferocity and also what happens to the African-American soldiers at the conclusion of the battle at the hands of the Confederate forces. Next slide, please. If the Battle of the Crater exemplified the continual hardening of the American Civil War, the logistics operation that supported the U.S. Army at Petersburg is one of the campaign's most fascinating and instructive aspects for the modern observer. City Point, a small peninsula across from Bermuda Hundred at the confluence of the James and Appomattox Rivers, became the Army's supply and command hub for the campaign, and it grew to truly massive proportions. And today, the area of City Point is preserved as a unit of the Petersburg National Battlefield Park. The hospital at City Point alone was the largest in America, covering 200 acres with a capacity of 10,000 beds. Docks for shipping, rail yards, livestock corrals, bakeries, repair shops, foundries, a rail yard, command headquarters, living quarters, rest and recreation facilities. City Point truly had it all. And it became also the target of Confederate saboteurs on 9 August 1864, when a Confederate agent emplaced what he called a horological torpedo, what we would call today an IED, or improvised explosive device, aboard a northern freighter at the City Point docks. The photo on the right shows the immense damage after the explosion, which killed some 200 people and destroyed ships, docks, and warehouses along the river. The U.S. Military Railroad, which originated at City Point and encircled the U.S. Army's lines around Petersburg, is another great example of the significant modernity of the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign. Railroads, of course, were an important part of infrastructure and transportation in the nation before and during the war, but only at Petersburg did they serve in a directly tactical role. The troops and laborers of the Military Railroad constructed track, sidings, and stations throughout the zone of operations and ran trains around the clock to service the Army in the line, sometimes directly approaching the front lines of the campaign. The trains moved people and supplies rapidly around the battlefield and no doubt saved lives by quickly transporting wounded soldiers to the base hospital at City Point. One particularly evocative memory of the railroad comes from Union and Confederate soldiers who served in the lines and wrote in memoirs that they could frequently smell the aroma of fresh baked bread from City Point, from the ovens being offloaded and carried in wagons to the frontline trenches for Union soldiers to eat. And so this would have caused a definite morale impact on the Confederate soldiers who faced them, who were on short rations throughout the war, and frankly, considering whether or not to desert and to leave and to go back home as the war's fortunes turn against them. Other technical innovations served to modernize the conflict at Petersburg as well, as both armies constructed telegraph lines, employed mines, and we're talking about landmines, dug canals, surveyed military roads, camps, and trenches, and constructed hardened, elevated observation posts. In general, these logistical and support capabilities truly demonstrated the U.S. Army's continued material superiority that came to play such an important role in Northern victory by late 1864, when combined with the leadership and the strategic planning of Ulysses S. Grant. Next slide, please. Although the Civil War continued well past the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Court House on 9 April 1865, the victory of Grant's U.S. Army forces over Lee's army constituted a watershed moment in the course of the Civil War. By 1865, Lee and his men were the only remaining unifying and inspiring institution in the Confederate States, as the people in those states grew increasingly desperate and tired of the war. But as I have demonstrated in this discussion, the outcome of the Richmond-Petersburg campaign was not preordained in any way. Grant's victory came at incredible cost in lives and treasure, and came about only due to his persistence and vision the Herculean efforts of his commanders and their soldiers, buttressed by a national system of support that, although it was strained to its absolute breaking point by early 1865, somehow held on to the end of the war in victory. The formerly enslaved population of Richmond, Virginia, must have thought they were witnessing the hand of God, indeed, when ranks of Black soldiers marched into the ruined city in the image that you see on the left of the slide. And they brought that day of Jubilee with them, the day of freedom from oppression and servitude. For all of these reasons, I will always believe that the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign encapsulates the American Civil War in all of its most important educational, indeed interesting and decisive dimensions. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd like to address your questions and comments now.
Charles, thanks very much for that program. Very good, especially your illustrations. We really appreciate it. We're going to move to some questions now. First, let's go to a longtime friend of Civil War preservation in the Central Virginia area. His question is, was General Grant the strategic commander and General Meade the operational commander, executing battle commands throughout the Petersburg campaign? And did Grant and Meade have any open command issues?
Great question. Thank you. What you describe in your question is what we would call the doctrinal template for the command relationship between General Grant, who by this point is not a field commander. At this point during this campaign, General Grant is the commander of the armies of the United States. And so he has a national command of all armies and exercises strategic control of all of these armies. He decides to site his headquarters with George Meade's Army of the Potomac for a couple of reasons that bear on the question that you asked. First and foremost, he decides to operate in the field with Meade because he wishes to disengage himself from what he sees as the political maneuvering and questions that will come from his presence in the capital and the distraction that could cause him as the war's strategic military leader. He also makes the decision to keep an eye, frankly, on George Meade and the Army of the Potomac because of the reputation that army had developed over the course of the war in the East, much of which is unfounded, but that doesn't make it any less true. And so when Ulysses S. Grant comes from the West with an attitude and a record of really an unbroken string of victories, he is a bit suspicious of the capabilities of these Eastern armies, and he wants, frankly, to keep an eye on them and to make his own judgments. But in that context, the question is correct. Meade's job as the commander of the Army of the Potomac is to carry out the campaign and the battles that fit inside that campaign under the strategic direction of Ulysses S. Grant. The fact remains, though, in reality that during the campaign, and we're talking about from the first day of the Battle of Wilderness to the end of Petersburg, there will be a frequent malleability of that relationship between Grant and Meade. And in a number of cases, on a number of junctures, through frustration or through a desire to be involved in victory, Grant will begin to go around Meade, to make tactical direction of his forces, to make really direct suggestions that take the form of orders to move this way, to move that way, to do these sorts of things. And in some cases, Meade will or Grant will actually issue orders to the forces of these armies in his own name. And so there is a good deal of bleed over between the two levels. That is not, I don't believe that was the intent that Grant went into the campaign with, but that's the reality of the situation. And this relationship did become strained at points during the campaign. And we can say in general that the relationship becomes more strained as the campaign goes on. And so by the time the armies reach Petersburg, the relationship is not terribly productive. The two men maintained an immense amount of respect for one another throughout the war, and their writings and their actions during the war convey this respect and the military professionalism with which they acted. But there were a great deal of stresses and strains.
Okay, thank you. I have another interesting question from an audience member who's going to be doing some walking around battlefields pretty soon. His question is, he's planning to walk a limited number of Overland campaign sites over 2 or 3 days. In your opinion, what are the top 2 or 3 sites to visit?
Great question. For the Overland campaign, for me, a couple of places are must visit spots. One would be at Spotsylvania Court House, and that's the area of the Mule Chute, the famous Confederate salient along the lines at Spotsylvania, where again some of the most brutal fighting of any war happens, and so that is a uniquely, as one of my best friends says when he goes to that spot, it's a truly spooky place. Because it's beautiful and evocative, but at the same time, it's haunting for what occurs there and a knowledge of what occurs there. Another great sort of under-visited place along the Overland campaign is at North Anna. And so the Civil War Trust and the state of Virginia have preserved another really well-preserved extant state or set of Confederate trenches along the North Anna, the famous inverted V position of Lee's defenses on the North Anna, which frustrate Grant and Meade at the Battle of the North Anna. So those, and then finally, I would end up down at Cold Harbor, just because so much myth surrounds the actions at Cold Harbor. You know, when I, as a boy growing up in Tidewater, Virginia, I was taught the mantra that Grant's forces suffered 10,000 casualties in 30 minutes of fighting, and that it was the worst defeat ever suffered by American arms in military history. The truth is less stark than that, and there's a great deal of complexity to the battle. But I would say that for the Overland campaign, those are the sites that I would not miss.
Great, thanks for those choices. Charles, a fellow Army historian of ours, is asking about Grant seems to have tried often to achieve a knockout blow of Lee and the Confederates through decisive battle. Why do you think Grant remained focused on battle despite questions about its utility?
That's a great question. I think it relates to, just as I said, to Grant's understanding of the of how wars are fought and how victories occur, and they relate to the idea of persistence. I think, and that gets to that quote that we displayed at the beginning for the 1864 campaign, that you want to find your enemy, you want to hit him as hard as you can, and you want to keep hitting and keep moving on. But what I think Grant displayed, so the questions of Grant's tactical abilities, in my opinion, is one of those enduring debates. And it gets back to that old urban legend of Grant being a butcher, that he was simply a man with no tactical sophistication who just threw his enemy at or threw his forces at the enemy without regard to maneuver or tactics. I don't think that's true. I think Grant realized that his forces had an incredible numerical and material preponderance over the enemy. And that, second of all, that those forces represented, as I said, the intellectual and spiritual heart of the Confederacy. And so he recognized that pursuing defeat of those forces in the most timely manner possible was, in his opinion, the best route to victory. And so I think there was a balance that he tried to seek between maneuver and direct action and fighting throughout the war, and that could only come in the case of an adversary as skilled as Robert E. Lee, with large numbers of casualties.
Okay, thank you. Two more questions that are similar in scope, so let me try to combine them here. How did President Lincoln and the Republicans politically support the massive casualties incurred over such an extended period? And the other part of this question, which is kind of a second question that was asked, is how did the upcoming presidential election influence Grant and or Meade in their strategy?
Great questions, and I think they get to the heart of the matter when you talk about the strategic and grand strategic implications of a campaign like Richmond-Petersburg. The answer, I think, to the first question relates to Lincoln's ability to forge and maintain a national coalition of Republicans and Republican adjacent and sympathetic people throughout the war. And as we talked about, that meant in frequent cases relying on political stakeholders to recruit and maintain forces, but also to carry his vision and his platform for conducting the war into northern communities. And so that becomes the importance of leaders like Benjamin Butler, again, who's a Republican politician from Massachusetts. Men like Franz Sigel, who is a German American with significant German American popularity, a major immigrant group in the North before the Civil War, and Lincoln's ability to maintain a relative solidarity among his party and among the nation throughout these ridiculously costly campaigns comes from that ability to maintain a political coalition. And so Grant really focused on so much of his effort on maintaining that coalition, both in Congress and in his ability to interact with the Army's senior leadership. And so I sort of had a senior moment and lost the second part of the question. John, can you refresh me?
How did Grant and Meade let the upcoming election influence their strategy?
Another good question. I don't think they let it influence. I would look at it in the other direction, actually. And I think that Grant and Meade understood the importance of battlefield outcomes to the election, and that meant that they needed to keep going and to keep on the offensive, in spite of, in the summer of 1864, what really looked like the situation was that they were going to continue to settle down into siege warfare. And so this is the reason that Grant, as I said, the campaign stretches far and wide beyond Petersburg. And so during the summer and the fall, Grant is launching expeditions into the Shenandoah Valley. He sends Phil Sheridan along the Virginia Central Railroad. He eventually gives him command in the Shenandoah Valley to burn out Confederate logistics and farms in the Shenandoah Valley and to remove that sense of support before the election. So I think all of these actions are with an eye toward the upcoming election. And then closer to Petersburg, in the fall of 1864, Grant, or Meade rather, will launch actions along Hatcher's Run to the southwest of Petersburg, again, just as an effort in the immediate run-up to the election to convey to the northern people that they are doing their level best to continue to pursue victory.
Okay, interesting question here about the morale in the area. Question is, what was the mood like of the military and civilians in the Petersburg area, including newspaper coverage? This is among Southerners. Was the morale low, or were they confident they could somehow win this? They certainly held out for a long time, but looking back, the odds were against them. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. And again, I will refer to A. Wilson Green, who, before he wrote the book, which I think is the standard book, the first of two on the campaign, A Campaign of Giants, he wrote a really interesting book about Civil War Petersburg. So it's more of a social history of the town. And what Green finds is that in spite of the hardships of the war, the Confederate soldiers in and around Petersburg and the townspeople, to a remarkable degree, maintained a level of morale and optimism really up until the very end of the war, up until when the end was no longer in question, when Lee's men depart. But you have to be honest that part of that morale factor came from the fact that they really had the great Robert E. Lee in their midst, and that he lived there And so there was incredible belief in Lee's almost mystical ability to produce victories. And so you would have to think that that had a large role in the morale of the town and the army. But in general, in spite of incredible hardship, morale remained really throughout the campaign for the defenders.
So one of our audience members asked, for this campaign, how did Lee's casualty rates compare to Grant's?
They were actually roughly comparable because these actions involved a great deal of attack and counterattack. And so while in the aggregate, because they carried out more offensive actions than defensive actions, the federal casualties outnumber Confederate casualties during the campaign. But the important thing to remember for Lee is that his casualties are really not replaceable by this point. There is more manpower in a general sense to be had for Northern forces throughout the campaign, but Lee's losses really begin to pile up by the end. And so in modern historians have described the way in which the army, as it departed Petersburg, again, thinking about contingency, we think about this as the end of the war because we know Appomattox is happening at the end of this retreat. But many modern scholars have shown that in fact, Lee left the fortifications of Petersburg with an army that was large enough to continue active operations. But during that retreat to Appomattox, it simply melted away. And so the impact of hardship and morale and defeat on the army causes an impact by that point.
Were Grant and Meade worried that the attack at the crater might succeed, thereby making the rookie U.S. colored troop units the heroes, to the resentment of both veteran troops and racist elements in the North? That might be the real reason for the last minute change in the attack plans. What do you think about that?
I think that's an interesting question, and it's an interesting thing to ponder, but my reading of the sources does not tell me that entered their equation. What we know about the deliberations for the attack tell us that the worry about leading the assault with Black troops was that I said, as Grant, I believe, mentions in his memoirs after the war, that there was the belief that such high casualties of Black troops would convey the idea that they were being sacrificed and they were sent in as cannon fodder. But you raise an interesting point in that the reaction to the success of Black soldiers in the first Battle of Petersburg, 15 to 18 June, does in fact create a lot of grumbling among the white soldiers who believe that the Black soldiers attacked fortifications that were lightly manned and that the Confederates were retreating from them, so that it didn't really matter what they did there, and the fact that in fact this would cause Northern leaders and the public to have, and I won't say the word, the N-word on the brain, and they in fact use that term because they worry that people will become infatuated by Black soldiers. But my reading of the sources doesn't tell me that they really believed that the action would be successful.
Mr. Bowery, thanks very much for joining us, and we will see you the next program. Good night, everybody.